Have you ever wondered why the greatest empires in human history do not die by the sword, but by the suicide of their own currency? We are taught to fear external threats, armies marching across borders, barbarian hordes at the gates, or nuclear missiles in silos. Yet if you look at the graveyard of civilizations from the marble halls of Rome to the industrial heartland of Weimar Germany, you find a terrifying truth. The true collapse does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the treasury. It begins when a society forgets the fundamental laws of economics and convinces itself that it can print prosperity out of thin air. There is a pattern, a mathematical inevitability that has repeated itself with haunting precision for 2,000 years. It happened in Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. And right now, at this very second, the warning lights are flashing red in the United States of America. The pattern is identical. It always consists of 5 distinct stages. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. It will change how you view every news headline, every price tag, and every political promise. We are not approaching the cliff. We are already falling. The only question remaining is whether you will hit the ground or if you will have a parachute. Welcome to the most important history lesson you will ever receive. Let us begin by dissecting the anatomy of a collapse. This is not chaos, it is a sequence. Stage 1 is debt accumulation. Stage 2 is monetization. Stage 3 is inflation. Stage 4 is loss of confidence. Stage 5 is collapse. The timeline can be compressed into months or stretched over decades, but the order never changes. To understand where we are today, we must first understand where we have been. America is currently sitting precariously at stage 4. We are past the point of simple course correction. We are past the point where the problem is merely visible. We are in the phase where the smart money is quietly heading for the exits right before the dam breaks. I am going to walk you through each stage using undeniable historical evidence so you can see exactly what is coming next. 4G1 is always the accumulation of unpayable debt. No government wakes up and decides to destroy its currency for fun. They are forced into it by an event that demands spending far beyond their revenue. It could be a war, a depression, a pandemic, or a bloated social state. The cause is irrelevant. The math is the master. In ancient Rome, the crisis was the cost of empire itself. By the 3rd century, Rome had ceased expanding. For hundreds of years, the Roman economy was a plunder economy. They conquered a territory, stole its gold and silver, and used that loot to pay the legions. But when the borders stopped moving, the loot stopped flowing. Yet the costs of maintaining legions from Britannia to Mesopotamia did not vanish. The military consumed 70 to 80% of the state budget without new gold. The emperors began to borrow, and when they could not borrow, they began to cheat. Move forward to 1914 in Germany. The crisis was World War I. The German Empire decided to finance the entire war effort, not through taxation, but through borrowing, gambling that they would win quickly and pay off the debt with reparations from the Allies. They lost the Treaty of Versailles, imposed a debt of 132 billion gold marks on a shattered nation. This was a sum that was mathematically impossible to repay. The new Weimar Republic was born into a coffin of debt in Argentina. The cycle has repeated 6 times in 50 years, driven by military spending in the 70s and unsustainable social promises in the 80s and 90s. In every case, the government spends more than it takes in accumulating a mountain of obligations that can never be serviced by honest taxation. Now, look at the United States. The modern era of debt accumulation began in earnest after 2001. The war on terror, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, cost $24 trillion when factoring in direct spending and long-term veterans care. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. We bailed out the banks. We bailed out the insurers. We stimulated the economy. We added trillions more. Then came the pandemic in 2020. In the blink of an eye, the government unleashed the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, PPP loans, and stimulus checks. In just 2 years, we spent $6.5 trillion. Today, the U.S. national debt stands at $37 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio is 132%. For context, when Weimar Germany began its hyperinflationary spiral, its debt-to-GDP was roughly 40%. When Rome began its collapse, scholars estimate it was around 30 to 40%. America's debt burden is 3 times higher than the historical examples that led to total ruin. The curve is exponential. We are adding $2 trillion of debt every single year. Stage 1 is not just complete, it has been maximized. This leads inevitably to stage 2, monetization. This is the turning point. In a healthy economy, if a government wants to borrow money, it issues a bond and sells it to a private investor. That investor buys the bond because they believe the government will pay them back with interest. This is market discipline. If the government borrows too much, the investors get scared, demand higher interest rates, or stop buying. But what happens when the debt is so massive that no private investor wants it? What happens when the interest rates required to attract buyers would bankrupt the state? The government calls the central bank enters the market and buys the government's debt, using currency that it creates. It is a polite word for counterfeiting on a national scale. In Rome, they didn't have a central bank, so they used metallurgy. The denarius was the standard silver coin of the empire. Under Emperor Augustus, it was nearly 100% pure silver. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in the late 3rd century, that same coin contained only 5% silver. It was a copper slug dipped in a silver wash. The government was melting down one coin to make two, effectively printing money to pay the troops. In Weimar Germany, the mechanism was more direct. The government would issue a treasury bill, and the Reichsbank was legally obligated to buy it with freshly printed marks. Printing presses ran 24 hours a day, staffed by shifts of workers who were destroying their own future with every sheet they fed into the machine. In Zimbabwe, they dispensed with the pretense of bonds entirely. The Reserve Bank simply credited the government's accounts with digital money to pay salaries. In the United States, we call it quantitative easing. It sounds sophisticated, technical, and harmless. It is none of those things. It began in 2008, but it went nuclear in 2020. The Federal Reserve announced it would buy unlimited amounts of government debt to stabilize the market. Between March 2020 and March 2022, the Federal Reserve printed nearly $5 trillion. They bought half of all the debt issued by the Treasury. Think about the absurdity of that loop. The Treasury spent IOU. The Federal Reserve prints new dollars to buy that IOU. The government is effectively paying its bills by typing zeros into a computer. This is the exact same mechanism that destroyed the German mark, the Argentine peso, and the Venezuelan bolivar. The scale is the only difference. We printed more money in 2 years than we had in the previous 2 centuries, combined. Stage 2 is complete. The ink is dry. The money is in a system. Then comes Stage 3. Inflation emerges. The laws of physics apply to economics. You cannot double the supply of money without devaluing the currency, any more than you can pour water into a glass of wine without diluting the flavor. When you print trillions of dollars and pour them into the economy, more units of currency end up chasing the same amount of goods and services. Prices must rise. This is not an anomaly. It is a cause and effect relationship. The defining characteristic of Stage 3, however, is not just rising prices. New is government gaslighting. The authorities will never admit that their money printing caused the inflation. They will blame greedy corporations. They will blame supply chains. They will blame Putin. They will blame the weather. They will call it transitory. In Rome, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in the year 301 AD. He tried to set price caps on over 1,000 goods from wheat to lions. He threatened death to any merchant who sold above the fixed price. It failed spectacularly. Merchants simply hid their goods. The economy froze. A black market exploded in Weimar Germany. The government blamed the inflation on the French occupation of the Ruhr and on Jewish speculators. They denied until the very end that the printing press was the culprit. In the United States, we saw this play out in real time. In 2021, as prices began to tick up, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department told us repeatedly that inflation was transitory. They said it was just used cars. It was just shipping containers by 2022. Inflation hit 9% by official numbers, and they finally retired the word transitory. But we must look closer. The official Consumer Price Index is a manipulated statistic. Over the last 40 years, the methodology for calculating SPINs. If we use the calculation methods from 1980, inflation in 2022 was not 9%, it was closer to 17%, but the real inflation shows up in assets. First, look at housing. The median home price in the U.S. skyrocketed from $260,000 in just 5 years. Look at the stock market detached from economic reality. Look at gold. Look at Bitcoin. These assets are screaming that the dollar is losing value. This is Stage 3. We are living in it. The purchasing power of your salary is being eroded not by accident, but by policy. Now we arrive at the precipice. Stage 4, loss of confidence. This is the most dangerous phase. In the first 3 stages, people are unhappy, but they still use the currency. They still save in it. They still price their labor in it. They trust that $1 today will be worth $1 tomorrow. But in Stage 4, that trust snaps. It is a moment when the population realizes that the government has no plan, that the debt is unpayable, and that the currency is a melting ice cube. This stage is characterized by the flight to real assets. In Germany, they called it the flight from the mark. It happened in 1923. People stopped holding money. As soon as they were paid, they ran, literally ran, to the shops to buy anything. A piano, a painting, a sack of potatoes, a razor blade. It didn't matter what it was, as long as it wasn't paper money. The velocity of money exploded in Venezuela. People began weighing bundles of cash, because counting it took too long in Argentina. The moment a paycheck arrives, it is converted into US dollars on the black market in America. Stage 4 has begun, but it is starting at the top of the food chain. The average citizen is still asleep, but the central banks and the billionaires are moving. Look at the data. Central banks around the world are dumping US treasuries. China has reduced its holdings of US debt by 40% over the last decade. Russia has eliminated its dollar reserves entirely. What are they buying instead? Gold. Central banks bought more gold in 2022 and 2023 than in any year since 1950. They are exiting the dollar. They are preparing for a post-dollar world. Look at the ultra-wealthy. Why is Bill Gates buying hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland? Why are tech billionaires building bunkers and buying remote islands? Why is the price of prime real estate holding firm despite high interest rates? Because the smart money knows that when stage 5 hits, paper assets go to zero, but real assets survive. We are seeing the de-dollarization of the global economy. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, got actively building a payment system to bypass the dollar. Saudi Arabia is considering pricing oil in yuan. The petrodollar system, the bedrock of American financial hegemony for 50 years, is fracturing. This is the loss of confidence. It is happening in slow motion, right now, and then inevitably comes stage 5, collapse. This is the terminal phase. It is the death of the currency. In this stage, the currency ceases to function as a medium of exchange. Hyperinflation takes hold in Weimar Germany. In the autumn of 1923, prices doubled every few days, then every few hours. A cup of coffee cost 5,000 marks when you ordered it and 8,000 marks when you finished it. The currency became trash. Children built kites out of banknotes. Women used bundles of money to fuel their stoves because it burned longer than the wood you could buy with it. Society broke down. Savings were wiped out. The middle class was pauperized. This economic chaos paved the way for political extremism. In Zimbabwe, they printed a $100 trillion note. It wasn't enough to buy a loaf of bread. Eventually, the system stops. The economy reverts to barter or adopts a foreign currency. In Rome, the collapse was a slow grind into the Dark Ages. Trade networks disintegrated. Cities emptied out. Literacy plummeted. The complex economy of the empire was replaced by local feudalism for the United States. Stage 5 would be a cataclysm unlike anything we have seen because the dollar is the world reserve currency. Its collapse would trigger a global reset. What does it look like? It looks like a bank holiday that never ends. It looks like price controls that empty the supermarket shelves. It looks like capital controls that prevent you from moving your money out of the country. It looks like the introduction of a central bank digital currency programmable dollar that the government can control, track, and expire to force you to spend. It is the end of financial freedom. How long do we have predicting? The exact timeline is difficult, but the velocity is increasing. In Weimar Germany, the time from the loss of confidence to total collapse was less than a year in Venezuela. It was a slow burn of 3 to 4 years. Given the massive size of the US economy and the inertia of the global system, we likely have a window of 2 to 5 years before the crisis becomes acute. But make no mistake, the trajectory is locked in. The debt is too high to repay. The interest payments alone are now exceeding the defense budget. We are borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. It is a death spiral, so what can you do? You cannot stop the collapse. The forces at play are larger than any individual, larger than any president, but you can survive it. You must position yourself now before the panic starts. The first step is to understand that cash is not a safe haven. It is a burning liability. You should keep enough cash for short-term emergencies, but your long-term wealth must be in assets that cannot be printed. Gold and silver are the only forms of money that have survived for 5,000 years. They are the insurance policy against government stupidity. When currencies die, gold rises. It is that simple. It preserved wealth in Rome, in Weimar, and it will preserve it today. Do not buy paper gold or ETFs. Own the physical metal. If you cannot hold it, you do not own it. Consider land and real estate. A government can print $1 trillion in a second, but they cannot print an acre of soil. Productive land, farmland, or rental properties with fixed-rate debt are incredible hedges. If you have a 30-year mortgage at a 3% interest rate and inflation goes to 20%, the bank is effectively paying you to live in your house. Your debt is inflated away, while the asset retains its real value. Educate yourself on Pine Thumb. Whether you love it or hate it, you cannot ignore its properties. It is a decentralized, finite digital asset that exists outside the banking system. It is the only asset in the world that is unseizable and unprintable. In a world of infinite fiat currency, absolute scarcity has infinite value. Finally, you must prepare your mind. The most dangerous aspect of a collapse is not the economic poverty. It is the social chaos. When people lose everything, they become desperate. They look for scapegoats. They demand strong leaders who promise simple solutions. The social fabric tears. You need to be resilient, adaptable, and self-reliant. Building a community of like-minded people is just as important as buying gold. The history books are filled with the stories of those who thought it can't happen here. The Roman senator resting in his villa, the Berlin banker sitting in his club, the Venezuelan engineer saving for retirement. They all believed their system was eternal. They were all wrong. The pattern is undefeated. Debt, monetization, inflation, loss of confidence, collapse. We are watching the sequel to a movie we have seen a dozen times before. The ending does not change. K is at the crossroads. The warning signs are not subtle. They are screaming. The debt clock is ticking and the sound is getting louder every day. You've been given the knowledge of the 5 stages. You have the map. You know what is coming. The storm is on the horizon, and the clouds are dark and heavy. Do not wait for the rain to start before you fix your roof. If you found this analysis valuable and want to stay ahead of the curve as this history unfolds, we will be tracking these metrics in real time, providing the intelligence you need to navigate the chaos. Thank you for watching, and good luck.